high in the mountains, where the air felt thinner and every breath demanded effort, a narrow stone path wound between jagged cliffs and silent pine trees, disappearing into mist so dense it made distance impossible to judge, and those who walked there quickly learned that the mountain did not care about confidence, titles, beliefs, or reputation, because stone does not respect comfort and elevation does not reward certainty. It only reveals what remains when comfort disappears, and on that cold morning the path was occupied by travelers, climbers, scholars, and wanderers, each carrying something visible on their backs and something invisible within themselves: fatigue, expectation, fear, pride, and the quiet need to prove that they could keep moving. And among them walked Friedrich Nietzsche, not faster than the others, not stronger in appearance, but strangely untouched by the discomfort around him, as if the mountain were not something to conquer, but something to listen to. And that difference did not go unnoticed, because people become aware of calm most clearly when they themselves are struggling. And one of the men climbing nearby, breathing heavily, his frustration becoming harder to hide with every step, looked toward Nietzsche and asked a question that had followed human suffering for centuries, asking what purpose pain could possibly serve, why struggle exists at all, and whether suffering had ever truly made anyone stronger, or whether it simply broke people more slowly. And the question moved through the narrow path like cold wind, because everyone who heard it recognized something personal within it, and pain, unlike belief, rarely feels theoretical, and Nietzsche did not answer immediately. And that silence created something unusual, because in places where breath is scarce, silence becomes heavier, and heavy silence forces attention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost softer than the mountain wind. And he said, that pain does not make a person stronger. Pain only reveals whether strength was ever being built at all. And the words did not land like comfort. They landed like truth. And truth rarely comforts at first, and the climbers around him reacted not with agreement, but with confusion, because the statement did not promise reward, did not offer hope, did not transform suffering into something noble. It simply removed illusion. And one of the travelers laughed, lightly at first, dismissing the idea as philosophical theater, saying that pain is pain, loss is loss, weakness is weakness, and nothing beautiful grows from being broken. And the laughter spread, not because it was understood, but because it restored comfort. And comfort is what people reach for when truth feels too sharp. And Nietzsche did not react, did not defend his statement. And that lack of reaction slowly began to change the rhythm of the climb, because when a man refuses to defend what he knows, others begin to question what they know, and the laughter became thinner, less certain, and the mountain path, once predictable, no longer felt entirely safe. The climb did not become easier after the question was asked. If anything, it became heavier, not because the mountain had changed, not because the path had become steeper, but because something had shifted in the minds of those walking it. And once thought begins to turn inward, even familiar weight can feel different, because physical struggle is often easier to endure than inner recognition, and the travelers felt that difference, even if they did not fully understand it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the comfort they had brought with them. And when comfort begins to weaken, awareness begins to grow. And awareness is rarely gentle, because awareness does not remove pain. It removes the stories people use to avoid it, and the people climbing beside him felt that. Pressure slowly began to build, not outwardly, but inwardly, because now the question was no longer about the mountain. It was about themselves, and personal questions are always harder to escape than philosophical ones. And one of the men who had laughed earlier slowed his pace, his breathing heavier now, his movements less confident. And after several silent steps, he looked toward Nietzsche again, this time without mockery, without performance, and asked what pain reveals if it does not create strength. And the question carried something new. Not resistance, not challenge, but vulnerability. And vulnerability is always more honest than certainty, because it appears when something real has finally been touched. And Friedrich Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that suffering reveals what a person runs toward and what a person runs from. And the words moved through the cold mountain air differently this time. Because they did not explain pain, they redirected it. And redirection is far more difficult to resist than contradiction, because contradiction creates defense. But redirection creates reflection, and reflection is slower, heavier, and more difficult to escape. And Nietzsche continued, saying that most people do not fear pain itself. They fear what pain exposes: unfinished wounds, hidden weakness, barred identities, desires that were never truly their own, and dreams they spoke about for years but never had the courage to pursue. And the words settled into the climbers with quiet weight, because they did not describe suffering as punishment. They described it as exposure. And exposure is something people instinctively resist, because what is exposed can no longer hide behind comfort, and comfort, once removed, reveals patterns, excuses, dependencies, and quiet forms of weakness that often go unnoticed in easier seasons. And the travelers around him felt that idea begin to move through them, not as agreement, but as tension, because now pain was no longer something external, no longer something caused by weather, distance, stone, or exhaustion. It had become something personal, something internal, something that reached beyond the mountain itself. And one of the younger climbers stopped, completely, his hand shaking slightly from fatigue, asking whether suffering breaks people or transforms them. And the question hung in the cold air longer than expected, because everyone walking beside him recognized something personal within it. And Nietzsche looked at him, not with sympathy, not with cruelty, but with clarity, and said that suffering does neither, at least not by itself, because pain has no purpose until someone gives it one. And the words moved deeper than anything before them, because they removed the comforting illusion that hardship automatically creates growth, that survival automatically creates wisdom, that endurance automatically creates strength, and instead they placed responsibility where most people least want it, within themselves. And the climbers felt quiet, not because they agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche, seeing that shift, did not push harder, did not raise his voice, because the mountain had already done enough. And instead he said that the strongest people are not those who avoid suffering, nor those who merely survive it, but those who force suffering to become material for transformation. And the words settled into the path with quiet finality, because they did not promise victory. They demanded creation, and creation is always heavier than survival. And the mountain, once felt as an obstacle, now felt like something else entirely, something less like resistance and more like revelation. The climb did not become easier after the question was asked, because what they were feeling was not exhaustion. It was something far more unsettling, a quiet realization that pain had never been their enemy, only the mirror they had spent their lives avoiding. And for the first time, the climb no longer felt like punishment. It felt like exposure. The mountain did not become kinder. The wind did not soften. The stones beneath their feet did not grow easier to climb. And yet, somehow, everything felt different, because something had shifted, not in the path, not in the weather, not in the weight carried on their backs, but in the way that weight was being understood. And that difference was enough to change everything. Because once a person begins to see suffering differently, suffering itself no longer holds the same power. And the travelers moving through that cold mountain air felt it, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they understood struggle, weakness, loss, and the quiet pain each of them had carried long before the mountain never appeared. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous, not because it removes pain, but because it removes the excuses built around it. And Friedrich Nietzsche walked calmly through that silence, not as someone untouched by suffering, but as someone who had stopped asking suffering to be fair. And that difference was impossible not to notice, because fairness comforts people, but clarity transforms them. And one of the younger climbers spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain, asking what happens to those who have already been broken, those who did, not grow stronger, those who lost something they could never recover. And the question carried something new, not resistance, not challenge, but honesty. And honesty is always heavier than certainty, because it appears when performance finally ends. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that being broken is not failure, pretending not to be broken is. And the words moved the mountain air with a kind of quiet force, because they did not glorify pain. They stripped it of performance, and performance is what most people hide behind when suffering becomes too personal. And Nietzsche continued, saying that pain becomes dangerous only when it remains unconscious, when it is hidden, denied, repeated, inherited, or carried so long that it begins to define the person carrying it. And the travelers felt that idea settle into them with quiet weight, because now pain was no longer something to escape, no longer something to conquer, no longer something to survive. It had become something to understand, and understanding is far heavier than endurance, because endurance only asks you to continue, but understanding asks you to change, and change is what most people fear more than suffering itself. And the climbers around him fell silent, not because they agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche stopped for the first time since the climb had begun, standing at the edge of the path where the mountain opened into endless distance, and he looked toward the horizon before speaking one final time, saying that the deepest wounds do not destroy a person. They reveal whether that person was ever truly becoming anyone at all, and the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not promise healing. They demanded transformation, and transformation is always heavier than recovery, because recovery tries to return you to who you were, but transformation asks you to become someone you have never been. And no one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to laugh at, nothing left to hide behind. And as Friedrich Nietzsche continued up the path and disappeared slowly into the mountain mist, the travelers remained exactly where they were, and yet none of them felt the same, because once a person realizes that suffering was never sent to destroy them, only to reveal them, they cannot fully return to the comfort of who they used to be. The mountain did not become kinder. The wind did not soften. The stones beneath their feet did not grow easier to climb. And yet, somehow, everything felt different.